I continue. Mr. Martin dismissed all this with an effort. It had been annoying, it had driven him near to distraction, but he was too solid a man to be moved to murder by anything so childish. It was fortunate, he reflected as he passed on to the important charges against Mrs. Barrows, that he had stood up under it so well. He had maintained always an outward appearance of polite tolerance. So from here we can understand his character. Why, I even believe you like the woman, Miss Peart, his other assistant, had once said to him. He had simply smiled. A gavel rapped in Mr. Martin's mind, and the case proper was resumed. Mrs. Augen Barrows stood charged with wilful, blatant, and persistent attempts to destroy the efficiency and system of FNS. It was competent, material, and relevant to reveal her advent and rise to power. Mr. Martin had got the story from Miss Peart, who seemed always able to find things out. According to her, Mrs. Barrows had met Mr. Fitzwilder at a party where she had rescued him from the embarrasses of a powerfully built drunken man who had mistaken the president of F&S for a famous retired Middle Western football coach. She had led him to a sofa and somehow worked upon him a monstrous magic. The aging gentleman had jumped to the conclusion there and then that this was a woman of a singular attainments, equipped to bring out the best in him and in the firm. A week later, he had introduced her into F&S as his special advisor. On that day, confusion got its foot in the door. After Miss Tyson, Mr. Brundage, and Mr. Bartlett had been fired, and Mr. Manson had taken his hat and stalked out, mailing in his resignation later, old Roberts had been emboldened to speak to Mr. Fitzwilder. He mentioned that Mr. Manson's department had been a little distracted, and hadn't they perhaps better resume the old system there? Mr. Fitzwilder had said certainly not. He had the greatest faith in Mrs. Barrow's ideas. They require a little seasoning. A little seasoning is all, he had added. Mr. Roberts had given it up. Mr. Martin reviewed in detail all the changes wrought by Mrs. Barrows. She had begun chipping at the cornices of the firm's edifice, and now she was swinging at the foundation stones with a pickaxe. Mr. Martin came now in his summing up to the afternoon of Monday, November the 2nd, 1942, just 1 week ago. On that day at 3 p.m., Mrs. Barrows had bounced into his office. "Boo!" she said. She had yelled. "Are you scrabbing around the bottom of the pickle barrel?" Mr. Martin had looked at her from under his green eye shade, saying nothing. She had begun to wander about the office, saying nothing. Taking it in with her great popping eyes. "Do you really need all these filing cabinets?" she had demanded suddenly. Mr. Martin's heart had jumped. Each of these files, he had said, keeping his voice even, plays an indispensable part in the system of FNS. She had brayed at him. Well, don't tear up the pea patch, and gone to the door. From there she had bawled, but you sure have got a lot of fine scrap in here. Mr. Martin could no longer doubt that the finger was on his beloved department. Her pickaxe was on the upswing, poised for the first blow. It had not come yet. He had received no blue memo from the enchanted Mr. Fitzwilder bearing nonsensical instructions deriving from the obscene woman. But there was no doubt in Mr. Martin's mind that one would be forthcoming. He must act quickly. Already a precious week had gone by. Mr. Martin stood up in his living room, still holding his milk glass. Gentlemen of the jury, he said to himself, I demand the death penalty for this horrible person. The next day, Mr. Martin followed his routine as usual. He polished his glasses more often and once sharpened an already sharp pencil, but not even Miss Peart noticed. Only once did he catch sight of his victim. She swept past him in the hall with a patronizing "Hi." At 5:30 he walked home as usual and had a glass of milk as usual. He had never drunk anything stronger in his life, alcoholic means, unless you could count ginger ale, a kind of beer. The late Saint Schlosser, the SOFNS, had praised Mr. Martin at a staff meeting several years before for his temperate habits. So this is giving his characteristics as well. Our most efficient worker neither drinks nor smokes, he had said. The results speak for themselves. Mr. Fitzwilder had sat by, nodding approval. Mr. Martin, still thinking about the red letter day, as he walked over to the Shrubs on Fifth Avenue near 46th Street. He got there, as he always did, at 8 o'clock. He finished his dinner and the financial page of the Sun at 8:45, as he always did. It was his custom after dinner to take a walk. This time he walked down Fifth Avenue at a casual pace. His gloved hands felt moist and warm. His forehead cold. He transferred the camels from his overcoat to a jacket pocket. He wondered as he did so if they didn't represent an unnecessary note of strain. Mrs. Barrows smoked only Luckies. It was his idea to puff a few puffs on a camel after the rubbing out, stub it out in the ashtray holding her lipstick-stained Luckies, and thus drag a small red herring across the trail. Perhaps it was not a good idea. It would take time. He might even choke too loudly.